Welcome to 60 minutes of unscripted .NET entertainment, and also two guys not sorting out who's actually going to cue the intro video.
Oh, that was amazing.
So our mission, aside from making absolute fools of ourselves, is to empower the .NET community to achieve more. I am your host, Cam Soper, with co-host David Pine.
Hey.
We'd like to welcome today's guest, who is also often one of our co-hosts, Luis Quintanilla. Luis, tell us a little about yourself, please.
Yeah, sure. So I am a PM at Microsoft, and I work at the intersection of AI and ML and the .NET space, right? So that includes, ML.NET and the variety of tools that are available there, so you can train your own models. And then most recently, I've been having a chance to play with OpenAI, ChatGPT, and all that fun stuff, which I'm really excited to talk to you all about today.
So that's what you're going to tell us about today, right? Is ChatGPT with .NET, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So is this something that is like really hard and scary to learn, or is this going to be something where everybody goes, "Oh my gosh, I have to try this"?
Hopefully not. There's actually a few ways that I'll show how you can kind of get started, depending on sort of where you are. If you're like, I don't really feel comfortable starting with a code first approach, there's a few really nice tools there. And then also, if you just want to dive into the code, I'll sort of show that off as well. So really, wherever it is that you feel comfortable starting, it's there's a lot of options for you.
Oh, cool. Well, let's dive in.
Sweet. All right. So actually, let me start off with the playground here. So this is if you go over to the openai.oai.azure.com website, right? Assuming that you have Azure OpenAI resources provision. One of the places where you can sort of get started with ChatGPT is through this playground. Now, one of the really sort of, to take a bit of a step back here, basically ChatGPT, what it is, it's just a model, a large language model. And it's built upon GPT. And one of the things, as sort of the name implies it, that it's a little bit different. And some of the things that it allows you to do is it allows you to have conversations or have these more conversational style of interactions with this large language model, as opposed to sort of one-offs, right? And so that's really the main difference here. But so once you're into Playground here, and also, by the way, this is also another sort of low-code way to get started. This is over at the OpenAI ChatGPT sort of website as well, right? And this is another really good way for you to get started. But let me just kind of step back here to the Chat Playground, because this has a few more features than sort of the OpenAI one that might be interesting to you, right? So
now, is this the, so in the Azure side, are we looking at GPT 3.5 or 4.0?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So in this one, it is 3.5. If one of the ways that you can sort of know that is if you go to deployments here, you'll see that the model that I'm using is Chat, or I called it Chat, but the actual model name is the GPT 3.5 Turbo, right? So a lot of folks might have more access to this one, right, as opposed to the GPT 4.
Well, what if I don't even know what GPT or OpenAI or artificial intelligence, like what is it too naive of me to say, what are we talking about?
No, not at all. And actually, there's a really good introduction here over in the Azure OpenAI service docs. See if the SEO works. Aha, it does. So if you go over to this sort of portal here over on the Learn site, you're going to find a lot of really good, an introduction and resources to get started here. But basically, OpenAI is a company, right? And they created these models, GPT, that allow you to do a lot of things that I'll kind of show in a little bit, such as, mainly around natural language. And so as opposed to training your own model where you have to get data and go through this process of training your own model, with GPT, natural language sort of becomes the interface to interacting with AI and performing tasks in an automated fashion with AI, right? And so, as I sort of mentioned earlier, GPT is the foundation or the base model. And then ChatGPT just built on top of that, right? And it's specifically tuned to, again, have these conversational interfaces. Again, still relying on the natural language to perform tasks on your behalf. But then again, it's just there's a few additional sort of differences with GPT that make it really nice in terms of having a chat history or conversation history, as well as well-defined roles here that identify like who's speaking or where the responses are coming from in the conversational interface.
Love it. Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah. No, that's a really good question. Again, let me see if I can sort of paste the link here so you folks can have it. Check out the resources here because that's there's a lot of really good stuff in there. Okay, yeah, so this is using GPT 3.5 Turbo or ChatGPT. And if I go over to the chat tab here, you're going to see that it starts off with this setup, right? And what this setup provides you is an interface for you to define or guide what sort of the persona, the tasks that this agent is going to perform on your behalf, and things like that. So out of the box, you're going to have a few sort of templates that are set up for you. If I go to default here, you're going to see that by default, the system message, which is, again, what provides that guidance for this agent for you to interact with. That belongs in the system message here. And you can see here that it's very minimal. And basically, it's just saying you're an AI assistant that helps people find information. So that's pretty generic. And well, that's going to work. And it's going to at least put the agent, this AI assistant, into a certain, it's going to give some guidance. It's not very helpful. So what you're really aiming for in the system message is really trying to nail down sort of what behavior you want this AI assistant to have, and how you want it to generate responses. What specific domain is it supposed to be an expert in, so on and so forth. And so if I were to change, for example, to the hiking recommendations bot, you can see that this system message is a little bit more robust. So here I'm telling you that this is the agent is a hiking enthusiast named Forrest. So The AI assistant has a name or persona. It's upbeat and friendly. Whenever it introduces itself, says hello, and then as it's trying to make recommendations for folks, right? It needs two things. Number one, it needs to know where that person is located, and it also needs to know what the hiking intensity is that they're looking for. And then what it will do is, once it has that information, it will go ahead and provide 3 suggestions of nearby hikes, as well as provide additional information here, right? And so with the system message, that's enough to get us started here. Now, the other part that I sort of mentioned, or where ChatGPT is different than GPT, is this message history, right? So in this case, I'm telling it, keep up to the last 10 messages. And what that's going to do is it's going to provide additional context for the bot. So again, in a conversation, typically when you're having a conversation with somebody, you don't have to restate the context that you're in all the time, right? You might say, I went to the park yesterday. And then you might say, how was the weather, right? Now, as two people interacting, we might know that fact that, I was just telling you that I was at the park, that when you ask the question, how was the weather, or what was the weather like, that it's in reference to yesterday when I went to the park, right? And so the conversation history really helps inject that context in the reference, or in the state of a conversation. That really helps again provide that sort of multi-turn dialogue with this AI assistant. And so let me kind of get started just to see how does this work. So if I were to say, hi, looking for hiking recommendations. Now at this point, the assistant, again, its name is Forrest, and it's going to try to help me find hikes. And again, notice how here it's asking me, where are you located and what level intensity? Okay, so I am in park and I want low intensity hikes. Okay, and then you can see right away, now that it knows my location and what the intensity hikes I want, it's going to go ahead and provide me with a list. Right now, what it's using in this case is just information that it was trained on prior. Right? So it's using the information from the internet that it was trained on. So that's great. It's giving me the information that I want, but I want to perhaps maybe list this out in a nicer format. So I will say format.
So
Yeah.
when you say trained on, was this a data set that you trained it on, or is this off the shelf in the GPT model?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So it's off the shelf. So whatever the base model has, that's sort of the information that it's going off of. So I would presume that it got this from either Wikipedia or somewhere else in the original training set that OpenAI used. The fine-tuning aspect of these things, or providing your own data, we're going to kind of get to that, and there's different ways that you can sort of do that here.
Yeah, we do have some questions coming in. One of them relevant to what we're looking at right now. So Fuel Stumble is asking, how many words can they pass to ChatGPT here?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I forget exactly what the token is for these latest GPT models, but you have this sort of indicator or this counter here that tells you where you're at. So I believe that the limit is 4,000. And so far in the context of this conversation, we only use about 700. Right.
So does that mean a token is equal to a word, or is it like some sort of custom calculation on like the length of the word and complexity? And
yeah, so it really varies, but you can roughly think of it as that. A token equals a word, generally speaking. There are some edge cases, of course, as with many things, but in general, a token is a word.
And then there's lots of questions here. So let me keep diverting attention to Twitch here. So they're asking, how do they deal with large documents in case they'd like ChatGPT to extract information, say from a PDF with 100 pages?
Yeah, so I'll kind of show that in a little bit, but essentially the long story short is you want to, there's many different techniques, but generally what you would want is you want to sort of split up that document, either by page, or you might even, split it up at the, what's it called? Split it up at the paragraph level, right? And so again, always keeping a reference saying like, okay, here's a paragraph from this document, from this page. You might have additional metadata that sort of gives you information about where you are in the document, in the context of the document. Mm-hmm. But that's a way that you can split it up. And you can think of it also like if you were looking for information, right? You might not go and look through a an entire document in order to find it, you will go, perhaps you look at the table of contents, use some sort of reference to guide you to the most relevant section in a document to help you find your answers, right? So in a very similar way, you can kind of do this with these AI assistants.
Yeah, they're going to keep pushing the envelope here. So, so like, what if they split up the document? So how exactly can ChatGPT come up with a summary? Like, won't this information be lost? And how do you give it that additional context?
Yeah, so it won't, if I understand the question correctly, you never lose it, right? So something that I won't necessarily get into in this sort of talk, but basically you can think of it as sort of a data ingestion pipeline, right? Where if you have a set of documents that you would like ChatGPT to query, you essentially would go through a process of storing them somewhere. You process them by chunking them or splitting them into these respective sort of pieces of information that you then search before you send the query to ChatGPT. You query for the most relevant documents based on your query, and this is actually a pretty common pattern that sort of come up, right? Where you first look for relevant documents, and then you inject them as part of your prompt in order to provide the information for ChatGPT to then go ahead and try to answer or find your answer. And yes, the RAG, or retrieval augmented generation pattern, is what this is known as, right? So no information is really lost because all your data is stored in some sort of a vector store, maybe Cosmos DB, Azure Cognitive Search, right? In one of these places, you can have this information stored, and you're retrieving that sort of on demand based on the question that you're asking to be able to answer the question.
That makes sense.
So hopefully that helps.
Yeah. And then they had two other questions earlier, and let's just get those out of the way right away. So they're asking specifically in Azure, does ChatGPT run in European servers if they have a need for it? I'm assuming that's relating to GDPR. And then also a follow-up question to that is, can they avoid data that they provide from being stored and used?
Yep. So for that, I would also point you here to the documentation. I think if I go, let me just double check here real quick. If you go over to models, it will typically tell you, let's see, model summary, region availability. Okay, yeah. So if you go to the model summary table here in these documents, I'll sort of try to put into the chat here. It'll tell you, where it's available, the different regions. And so I would encourage that you take a look at this, right? Again, this is always changing, right? So, that's why I refer to the docs because that's probably going to be the source that's the most accurate and up to date. In terms of data, I don't know where I would assume that the privacy policy is somewhere here, but I would encourage you to sort of look at that. But at least in the context of Azure, as far as I know, right? Like everything is sort of contained within your Azure sort of
subscription,
right word. So yeah, like at the subscription level, right? Exactly. So whatever sort of, whatever sort of security or configurations that you have there, right? They're confined to Azure, and so that's kind of one of the things where the Azure OpenAI service, right? If that's a concern, right, you might consider it.
Awesome.
Yep. Let's see. All right. Let's go back here to the chat playground. And actually, this is around the data, right? That's a really good question. So this assistant setup, right? One of the things that it allows you to do, and I won't really show it here, but it also allows you to add your data. And again, this can come from many different sources. So again, it could be from cognitive search. It could be from blob storage, or you can just upload files, which ultimately end up in blob storage and get indexed with Azure Search. So there's many different ways that you can sort of upload your data. And essentially what's going to happen is, again, as I mentioned, right, it goes through this sort of pipeline where it splits up the document into sort of digestible chunks that you can then pass to ChatGPT when you're asking your questions as part of your prompt. Okay, yeah. So the thing that where I kind of left off here was, okay, so I wanted to format it as a table. Now, I didn't tell the AI assistant here in the system message that it knows how to format tables. But again, ChatGPT, because it has, it's looked at so much information from the internet, and it kind of knows that when I ask it to format it as a table, it means, again, number one, it knows the context of the conversation. So it, right, what is it? In this case, it is, well, the message or the list of hikes that I gave it, that's the thing that I want you to format. And I want you to do that as a table, right? You can see that it goes ahead and it knows, again, because it has access to that chat history, that it needs to take the list that it previously gave me and format it as a table. Right?
So I just wanted to back up real quick. One quick question. You know, it seems as though there's almost like this misconception that ChatGPT can do everything, and it's like this magic wand that you just sprinkle on your apps, and all of a sudden they have all this artificial intelligence and they're super powered. But that's not really the case, right? Because this RAG pattern that we were talking about before, like the retrieval augmented generation, there's a lot of different services and other like underlying fundamental programming concepts and things that you have to be aware of and know how to string these things, kind of compose them together. It's not that ChatGPT is going to be able to do everything for you, right?
Right, exactly. And I think that this kind of highlights, let me go back here if this, so notice, for example, for GPT models, it knows, at least GPT-4, right? It knows information up to 2021. So if you asked it about anything that happened after 2021, it has no idea, or like it's not going to be able to answer it. Now, again, providing, maybe a news article or something like that, you might be able to give it information, right? That's a little bit more up to date to help it answer a question that you may have or some sort of request or instruction you may have. But again, it's trained up to September 2021. And more importantly, though, right, this was trained on sort of public data. So it doesn't know anything about your enterprise, right? So, and that's really where it's most useful. So in your company or even in your side project, right? Like it doesn't know about the all the projects that you've sort of built, that maybe you just haven't put out publicly, right? And so that's kind of where these other services that David is sort of alluding to here, right? Like, maybe you have an index of this information, you have a database somewhere, whatever sort of, enterprise information is that you have available, right? You're able to sort of provide it to give additional context. But again, right, it's all these other services and all this data that you already had, maybe these processes that you've already had, that you're, again, just as it was mentioned here, right, just rub some ChatGPT on it. So ChatGPT is that interaction layer to your services, and actually show a way that you might have existing services and how you might hook them up to ChatGPT, right? So again, you're not, although in some cases you might be creating new applications, in a lot of cases you're just going to be adding a different sort of interface layer for your applications when it comes to .NET.
So it's really fair to say that it's just while there is a ton of hype and excitement, and there are some really, really interesting things that you can do with it to help, summarize things or extract some sort of additional benefit that may have not been obvious initially. It is really just another programming tool in our toolbox of things that we can utilize to solve problems.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the other thing that, I think somebody mentioned in the chat here, can I get access to this after the session? So one of the things, access to these resources, right? It's been challenging even for us, right? You might think, oh, you work at Microsoft, so you must have access to all the latest models, and that couldn't be further from the truth, right? So I'll kind of take a step back here, and kind of show this link here to the Azure AI services. You're going to see that there's a bunch of stuff here, like translation, speech, personalizer, right? And so, if you just need to do one thing, right? Like, yes, these models are not, in general, they're not ChatGPT, right? But if there's a task that you're looking to achieve, right? Like these might, work well enough for your scenario, right? And so, and in addition to that, right, you might even extend what ChatGPT does with some of these services. So, for example, I think, David built a Blazor application before, right? And he hooked up a few of these services here, right, that enhance the capabilities that ChatGPT provides you, right? So, yeah. Let's see, any more questions? ChatGPT deduce answers logically.
Yeah. Can ChatGPT deduce answers logically, even when certain data is missing? So, like based on its training data. That's a really good question. I'm not sure if you know, Luis.
So when certain data is missing based on its training data, yeah, I mean, I think in general, like if it's a fairly general question, chances are it was somewhere on the internet, right? And it will try to come up with an answer. Again, right, it's going to be very limited by, when the model stopped, the last date that the model was trained. So again, if you asked it anything past September 2021, even though it may ask a logical, the answer may seem logical to something, if it has, if there's data missing there, right, it might have a hard time. And I guess
what's really interesting about that, right, is it's such a smart thing, but its
Yep.
limitations are limited such that you can't say, hey, ChatGPT, what's the weather?
right.
Because it doesn't
Yeah.
know, it doesn't have that context. So it's limited by when it was trained, like you had mentioned, and it's a generalist. So if you're able to find it on the internet, chances are maybe not, right? So I guess
Yeah.
it depends.
Yeah, and sometimes also what you're going to have to do is it doesn't really reason, and sort of that's where you might run into situations where it's going to output something that sounds reasonable, but it may not in fact be true, right? So you all want to make sure, like, there's the human aspect of it, right? Like you always want to make sure that you check and you verify, right, that it in fact is producing answers that you want it to, as opposed to something that sounds right, but it really isn't. And again, it goes back to those limitations, the data that was trained on, data that it has access to in terms of context, and also the tools that it has access to, like plugins and functions and so on and so forth. Yeah.
I'm having so much fun in this episode. This is awesome.
No, yeah. I mean, we're just scratching the surface here. I haven't even got to the .NET part. Let's see. Okay, so that's basically what I wanted to kind of show you here, right? As I mentioned, you can add your data. But now, if you would say, hey, like this is great. It kind of helped me get started, but now I want to kind of go and transition to some code. And you can see that if you click on the View Code tab here, and then select C#, right, you'll see that this is, it configures this, at least this interaction, right, for us. And it kicks us off with this chat role system message, which is the one that you find here. And then you can see that there's other roles like the user, and this contains the messages that I send, and then the role of the assistant, which is the responses that come back from the assistant, right? And in this case, it's kind of hard coded, right? But you could imagine sort of taking this and using it as a starting point to then start building on top of it inside of your applications. And what it's using here is this Azure AI OpenAI NuGet package, right? And that's how you can interact with both the Azure OpenAI service. But one of the other things that I sort of mentioned is, if you don't have access to the Azure OpenAI service, you can also use this SDK to interact with OpenAI in general. So again, it's just, as long as you provided your credentials, your key, it works just the same, right? So regardless of, again, Azure OpenAI service or OpenAI itself, you're able to just use this .NET SDK to build your .NET application, or integrate into your .NET applications. Okay, so let's take a look at what ChatGPT can do, ChatGPT. So, as mentioned before, right, like there's a lot of things that this model can, or a lot of tasks that it can perform. So, for example, let's say that you were, I think Cam mentioned that, as a content developer, sort of generate ideas, kind of brainstorm, right? It might be a really good tool for that. And in this case, essentially what it's doing, or the task that I set it out to do, is, turn a product description into an ad copy. And sort of all of these parameters here, they're just configurations. One of the things that is probably the most, so there's a few here that are, relevant, but probably the most relevant ones that you're going to be setting oftentimes are going to be max tokens and temperature. Max tokens meaning like how many tokens should I return or generate at a time. And then the temperature, which is actually not very intuitive. But what the temperature is, it's basically just how creative or how deterministic do I want my answers to be, right? And so temperature of 0 means that it's very matter of fact, and it's just going to give you the answers, and the answers in general are going to be reproducible, right? It's going to try to reproduce the same thing over and over. And then a temperature of 1 would mean that it's a little bit more creative, and it sort of, tries to, come up with many different versions of what an answer might be, right? And so in this case, we set the temperature to 0.5 because of that, right? We don't want it to be very sort of dry and, very matter of fact. We want a little bit of creativity in there, right? We want to give it a little bit of leeway as it's creating this sort of ad. And again, the prompt in this case, I'm just creating this sort of system prompt. And again, this is what's going to guide the model to sort of generate something for me. And so I tell it, write a creative ad for the following product, run on Facebook, name that parents. And then this is the product description here. And again, I'm using that Azure AI OpenAI SDK. Configuring a few things here with my endpoint, the client, configuring a few of those parameters with these completion options, and then just actually running it. And you can see that after I, say get my completions with the options that I provided to you, you can see that the response is, the ad itself is attention parents, you're tired of endless homework battles, blah, 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 right? And so it went out and generated this for me, right? And I could have had it generate 5 options. I could have had it generate multiple options here. Depending on what it is that I needed, right? And so you can see that in this case, it's using you can use it to sort of brainstorm or go back and forth, right? If you were doing code, right? If you're writing code, using things like Copilot, Chat, you might leverage that to sort of come up with different ideas or try to help you think through your code and what's happening there, right? So there's a lot of really, really good use cases here when it comes to, again, having that assistant that you can sort of bounce ideas off of. This is another relevant one, the airport code extractor. So let me just, I don't know if I ran this already. But this airport code extractor is, again, given a simple prompt for extracting airport codes from text. So in this case, I have the prompt, right, where I want to extract the airport codes from this text. And here's another way that you can sort of provide context to ChatGPT, right? So you might say, here's a sample of what a prompt or what an input from the user might look like, right? In this case, it's I want to fly from Los Angeles to Miami. And then the response that I want you to give me is, the actual airport code, which is going to look like LAX for Los Angeles and MIA for Miami. And then same thing, I want to fly from Orlando to Boston. And then what I expect for ChatGPT to do is just generate a completion for me. Right? And if I were to sort of, again, the process is very repetitive. You configure your client, you define your prompt, you set your completion options, and then you go ahead and run it. And you can see that MCO and BOS is the right response for Orlando MCO and Boston BOS. Right now, I don't think that this is actually. I don't think that this is a. Let's just do it live because why not?
Let's do it.
Let's see.
Oh, and while you're typing this up, I just wanted to call attention to this before. I know that there were some questions about ChatGPT's like ability to like comprehend contextual bits of information. And I know we've alluded to this a bit, but it's really trained as a generalist. So if you have your own data that you want it to be a specialist in, that's where that rack the point where it makes sense to do that sort of pattern, like is like the predecessor to that, which is like being a prompt engineer and really understanding how these prompts feed into the model and finding the best words and things like that, right? So like when you're showing these prompts here and you're defining these prompts, those are a very important part of how this all comes together, right?
That's correct. Yeah. What I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to, sorry, format, JSON. What I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to get a question that I think we got from Fuel, which is like, well, what if I wanted to extract information and I wanted to format that in a specific way in JSON? So that's what I'm kind of trying to do here. And you can see that I changed it from just giving me the actual, values of LAX and Miami. I actually say, okay, well, I need you to sort of, format it in this way. So that's what I'm doing here. And again, right, like the natural language, as sort of David mentioned, right, like that really becomes your interface. And these prompts really are the ones that are guiding the model in what exactly you expect for it to do. Oh no, did it not work? Let's see. Oh, I think I might know why this is not working. Here, no. The YouTube chat experience. Okay. Let's see. So it ran. Oh no, why is it not doing what I would expect it to?
Well, we're live, so this is kind of what I expected. Like this, this is the expectation.
Yeah, I'm just actually trying to see why this is not working. So if I go to prompt, my prompt completions, run it. No, why is that not? Oh, it's a stop? Weird. Anyway, what you should have seen is, let me see if I actually have a really good example here. Create study notes, C# to natural language, XML comments, explain code, extract contact information. No, this is not a good one either. This just has like, yeah, it just has. Anyway, so that's how you could essentially try to get it to do that, right? Like you basically tell it like, here's the output that I expect, right? And it, in theory, I don't know why it's not actually outputting, generating the output here, but it should have actually, generated this JSON here for me as I sort of specified it here.
And I just to say that I am apparently like way behind the curve and missing out in not using these interactive notebooks like this.
Yeah, Luis showed me that before, and I was like, my mind was blown. I was like, oh my God, that's so cool.
Yeah. No, yeah, totally. Like this is a really good place. And even for prompts, right? And this sort of prompt engineering workflow where it's very experimental, right? This is a really good way for you to try in like a code first manner, try out different types of prompts and see how far they get you, right? So this is a really good place for you to try that out. Okay, let's see. Okay, so I did sort of extracting contact information. Other places where this is actually useful is, for example, explaining code, right? So in this case, it's explaining C# in an understandable language. And you can see that I have this prompt, which is remove prefix, and I tell it, explain what this code does. And again, very mechanical here. Set up your client, define your prompt, define your options, do the thing, right? And we can see that in this case, it says it's a static method, it takes a string, and then it does stuff, right? And in general, right, this actually looks pretty good here. But not only can it sort of do that, right? It can also, where is it? Translate code, right? Translate English to other language. There we go. Translate programming languages. So this is another example of things that it can do, right? So in this case, I'm in my prompt, I'm telling it, I want you to translate this function from Python into C#, right? And I give it the Python function, and this is just the function here. And then I want to translate it to C#. And we can see, again, same steps. And what the output we get here is of course, this C#, which is the equivalent of the Python. So if you wanted to go ahead and try this, right, you can actually, I think we have the link available somewhere.
Yep.
But you can try all these samples and just, go and experiment and yeah, go for it. So what if you ask it to translate to VB? Yeah, that's a really good question. Let's see what it does. VB, just basics. Let's see. Response. Yeah, there you go. So that's in Visual Basic.
That's
and again,
really
right?
Cool.
Yeah.
So I know we're .NET and like we love like F# and VB and C#. What if we wanted to go off the cuff and say like translate this to some other language like Rust or entirely different?
Sure, I think so. I actually never used Idris, so if anybody in the chat has used it, you'll have to check whether it's okay. I guess this might be a way to do it.
I mean, it looks like it could be right.
Right.
All right, Fuel is checking me on this one. I don't know if he's saying it looks pretty good in the context of Idris or if it was in reference to the VB. But
oh, if someone said VB looks good, that I don't think that's ever a statement that should be said.
Hey,
personal opinions coming through.
Hey, we love VB developers.
Yes, we do.
Let's see. Yeah, and then this ChatGPT. This is actually just a different way that you might sort of implement whatever was done in that Azure OpenAI Studio, right? So it's very similar. Again, you just set it up. And then the difference is just in these other ones, I was doing sort of one-off completions. In this case, what I'm doing is I'm just leveraging the message right, and like using the chat history and using the user rules, using the where is it? Using the assistant sort of roles as well here, like adding the responses back from the history and doing that there. Okay, so let me kind of step back here and actually show you something else. So, so ChatGPT prompts are like a really good way of sort of getting ChatGPT to do stuff for you. But David sort of alluded this to before, which is like, for example, if you asked it, what is the weather like, or, what items do you have in stock, things like that. ChatGPT has no idea because it doesn't have access to additional data sources, right? Other than the ones that it was trained on, unless, again, you provide it and give it access to them through this RAG pattern. So what is a way that you can expose your existing services, maybe databases, whatever it may be, right? So that ChatGPT can actually make informed and create informed responses based on the information that you're giving it. And one of the ways, actually a pretty easy way to sort of do that, is with these ChatGPT plugins. And ChatGPT plugins are actually they're very basic in the standpoint that you don't really need a lot to get started with them. You need a web service, right? So ChatGPT needs to be able to call into some sort of web service. You also need an open API. So as opposed to OpenAI, open API, right? Specification. And you need this other thing called a manifest file, which is this AI plugin.json file. And so in this case, for this plugin that you're seeing here, let's take a look at the different parts. So in terms of a web service, this is a ASP.NET Core Minimal Web API. And what it does is there is some data. This could be a database somewhere. In this case, we just kept it as a JSON file. But again, it just contains sort of inventory or things that you have in stock at your outdoor sporting goods store. And so you have access to that data. And you have a single endpoint here called products that whenever a user submits a query for a product that they're looking for, right, it's just going to go and try to return a product, from your database. And again, we do all the, really good sort of conventions here. We're documenting this endpoint, which again is going to help in the generation of that open API specification. And the way that we generate the open API spec is, by configuring Swagger here. Right?
So far, this is just like a regular, like bog standard minimal API, right?
Yep, exactly. Yeah. So this is, forget the ChatGPT piece. Let's assume that this is your ASP.NET API or your web service of some sort, right? And chances are that you already have this web service, and chances are that you already have some sort of open API, definition or spec for it, right? So you're already like 2/3 of the way there. And so the last part that you need is just to expose it to ChatGPT. It's this manifest file, which, as you kind of see here, there's not a lot going on here. There is some information here about what your plugin should be called, as well as sort of a description of it, right? What it does. And there's both description for human or you when you see this in the store, as well as for the model in terms of giving it, again, that prompt or guidance on what exactly is this thing, what does it do, and how can I access it. And the question of how can I access it is this API. So there's this API property here where you provide a URL. And in this case, the URL is that Swagger sort of definition file, right? So that's how ChatGPT knows, hey, here's all the endpoints, here's the operations, the data types that it expects, all the information that I need to know to call this web service. I'm going to find it in this open API spec. And there's other information here, like, logo, if you want a nice logo to show up in the store, and other information here in case you want folks to contact you.
So do you have to tell the AI service which like verbs to throw at this endpoint, like a get or a post or whatever, or does it figure it out?
Nope, it figures it out based on this definition file. Right. So it just inspects this definition file, and then that's how it knows what the endpoints are, what verbs it can call, so on and so forth. In this case, it's super simple because it's just a single get endpoint, right? But you could imagine having a post, put other types of endpoints here. The other thing that I'll sort of call out is here is that documentation is key. So if and this kind of like gets into this really interesting topic of like, like you want to be able to communicate, even if you were talking, if you were handing this off to somebody, right? If you didn't document this properly, they wouldn't know what the correct way of calling these APIs are. And so ChatGPT in a similar manner, right? If you're very vague, like for example, if you don't give it like a name or you don't give it a good description of what it's supposed to do, and you don't take the time to document your APIs, ChatGPT is going to have a hard time sort of determining, like choosing one endpoint versus the other and producing the actual, correct response. So
just like another developer, it's looking at the generated documentation.
Yep, exactly. So make sure to document your APIs. And this is not just for ChatGPT. This is just in general, right? Like it helps your consumers. It helps other developers who are looking to work with your product.
That's awesome. So we did have a question real quick, Luis. TJABO from Twitch is asking, can GPT call APIs that are secured by managed identity? So I'm actually curious about that too. Or is this all open-ended API calls?
Yeah, no. So that's really good. So I am not an identity expert. What I can tell you is that, for example, like I think OAuth is one of the mechanisms that allows you to authenticate and authorize access to these endpoints. So it's not like, you have to make your API public or not have any sort of authentication authorization built in, right? In order for ChatGPT to use it. There is a mechanism in there for auth for working with these APIs.
But specific to Azure Managed Identity, you don't know the answer to that question.
Yeah, I don't know. No, specific to Managed Identity, I don't know. Yeah. But that is a good question. Let's see.
And that actually leads to a question that I had, Luis.
Mm-hmm.
So even though we're interacting with the Azure OpenAI service, these requests are being handled like not in Microsoft data centers, but in OpenAI data centers. Where are these requests actually being processed by these giant farms of GPUs?
Yeah, so the request itself for the data and sort of this API, like that's all sort of done on your servers, right? So wherever it is that you're hosting these web services, that's where the computation and all the processing takes place.
Yeah. I was just going to say, Code with Sean from Twitch is saying that if the code is running on Azure compute resources like app service, then yes, you can use managed identity because that's kind of
right.
It's all part of the infrastructure.
Yeah. Yeah, that would make sense. Let's see. Going back here, this is kind of like why the course is sort of configured here. It's because all ChatGPT is doing is saying like, look, I know that there's an endpoint that I have access to. There's a web service that I have access to, and I know that a user is trying to, is probably looking to use that service to perform some task. Right? And so what ChatGPT is doing is they're just effectively like the middleware that's just translating the user request into a request for your web service, and then formatting nicely the response that it gets back from that web service. And so, but all the computation is actually taking place wherever it is that you're hosting, these web services. ChatGPT is just sort of, again, that middleware that is doing the translation between user to the web service, in natural language, and then, returning a natural language response, as opposed to, just the JSON or XML sort of response that you would typically get using your standard HTTP client. And I'll kind of show you what that looks like. Let me just sort of start this up here. And how you would go about, registering one of these. So there it is, right? I just started this endpoint, and you can see that there is a single endpoint, and this works as you would expect it to. So I could get a list of products. If I go to try it out, a query, and I say hiking boots. Okay, you can see that this is what you would expect, sort of out of this UI, right? The Swagger UI. If we were to go to, I think it's v1/swagger.json. The actual documentation, the raw document. There we go. So back to your question, Cam, of like, what is ChatGPT using to understand what it needs to call? It's this swagger.json file. The YAML sort of version of this works as well, right? And again, there's, the type of responses that it generates, the description. Again, all of this was, automatically generated for us with, that Swagger package. And the values that it's using to populate these, like things like the operation ID and things like that, it's again coming from the values that you provided here for your endpoints, right? So this is all auto-generated for you here. Now, how do I go about actually using this with ChatGPT? So let me kind of go here. So if you go back to the chat.openai.com, again, if you have access to this, you can just click on plugins here. And you can see that at this point, there's no plugins enabled. So I'm going to go to the store. And you can see that there's a bunch of default plugins that are already sort of available for you to install, like Expedia and so on and so forth. But in this case, I'm going to say I want to develop my own plugin. And I forget, where was it listening on? I think it was 5290. Okay. So I'm going to paste that in. And I'm going to say find that. Just make sure that this is actually running. So 5290. To this thing here. I mean, I can't find. There we go. I don't know why. I guess it's expecting a certain convention. Anyway, so you can see that before it registers it tries to find the manifest and the open API spec. So you can see the manifest file is that AI plugin.json file. And here's the information that we had there, right? And it knows, again, that it's 5290. And then it also tries to validate the open API spec. So there's that open API spec that we're talking about. And so everything looks good. So we just say install localhost plugin. Okay, great. So now I'll say like, I'm looking for hiking boots. So notice how in this case, I'm sort of asking it in general sort of language so that I didn't have to go and format the JSON body or the query or anything like that. I just asked it, I'm looking for hiking boots. And then it knew like, oh, okay, I see that you have this plugin enabled, the Contoso, sort of product search. Let me use that to try to find what it is that you're looking for. And you can see what the response, what the request and response sort of look like, right? There's the query, hiking boots. So again, it translated, I'm looking for hiking boots into just the query itself. And in terms of the response from the search, right, that's actually what I would expect to, which is product. But again, notice how it didn't stop there. It took the response that it got from the service, and then it tried to sort of generate this, nicely formatted sort of response to the response that I got back from the web service.
Now, because
that's really cool.
Because the web service is local host, so it's using a cross-site request through the browser to get there.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that's kind of how we set this up here, right? Like we set up the cores here to be able to sort of do that.
So if you're running that, you could actually have a breakpoint here in Visual Studio to see ChatGPT, OpenAI hitting your plugin and executing that. That's absolutely
I think incredible. It should. Yeah, let me try that. Let's see. Can I don't know, whatever else. I don't know, here.
Do you have hiking boots that are purple? No. Dotnet purple.
Let's see. There we go. Okay, there it is. Right. So I just set that breakpoint, and you can see that if we inspect the query, it's camping gear, right? And so we can then sort of step through this just like you normally would for any sort of web service.
That is absolutely incredible. We do have another question here right away, and they're saying, how does semantic kernel fit into this?
Yeah, no, so that's a really, really good question. So right now, I haven't even brought semantic kernel into this because I'm just kind of trying to focus on the sort of the fact that it's just, you just need that SDK and, your prompt and sort of, off you go and you can generate these responses. Semantic kernel is actually really helpful when it comes to essentially orchestrating multiple workflows. So these are sort of one-offs, right? Where you are just you have a prompt and you're sending this request to ChatGPT. But imagine that you had a more complex sort of workflow. Like, for example, let's say that you were trying to write a book. I don't know, you want ChatGPT to write a book for you. And so in that context, you might need a few things, and there's a few steps that are involved in that process, right? And so each of those steps is going to have its own prompt. So for example, one would be to create titles. One would be to sort of generate outlines for each of the chapters. One would be, one skill or one sort of component in semantic kernel would be sort of the one that's writing each of the chapters, right? And so from these smaller components, you sort of chain them together and bring them together to orchestrate the end goal or the end task of writing a book for you, right? So semantic kernel is really powerful in being able to orchestrate across, the different resources that you're going to need and the workflows or the pipelines that you're going to be building, to achieve some task using AI, right? So some other things that semantic kernel sort of helps you with is, connecting to data sources, right? So we sort of were looking at, data sources before and the RAG pattern and stuff like that. And so chances are that you're not going to have that data in a JSON file. I actually had a sample here somewhere that tried to.
So while you're pulling that up, is semantic kernel like LangChain?
So you can think of it like, in the sense that it's an orchestrator and that it really simplifies, building out these workflows. You can think of it to a certain extent that way. But yeah. Let's see. Oh, sorry. Yeah, so I was pulling this up. So in terms of the data that you might be looking through, right? So this is something that we really didn't get into this chance around, but you might have embeddings, right? Which is a way that you encode text data into a sort of numerical high dimensional space that can make it really efficient when you're trying to compare or find relevant documents, right? And so in this case, basically what's happening here, right, is there's this sort of template and I'm injecting the sources. Semantic kernel kind of simplifies some of this workflow for you, right? And it sort of packages into these, individual units of computation that you can then sort of use again as one-offs, or you can sort of, chain together with other pieces here. So this is something that let me see if I can just run this and kind of show you what this looks like. Sources first. All right. So let me notebook cell, join cells, copy cells.
I know you're pulling that up. I just had to call attention to this. You said numerical high dimensional space and then just moved on quickly. My brain just went melted with like word.
That's a really good, no. Yeah, no, that's a really, so.
For us mere mortals, what does that mean?
So effectively the embedding, you take text and you pass it through some sort of model. And what the embedding will do is it will try to sort of map different pieces of meaning to some sort of numerical value, right? And so in this case, I think I forget how long I think it's 1,000 something floating point values that are here in this embedding. This is using the Ada 2 OpenAI embeddings models. And each of these pieces might sort of represent different things. So for example, like let's say that this was referring, you had a model that knew information about sort of movies, right? And so, one of these numbers might represent things like the genre. One of these other values might represent things like, I don't know, the length of the film. The other one might be the rating and stuff like that. So you're encoding through this model semantic information about that text. And then what you're able to do with this text after the fact is you're able to sort of compare it to other texts that may be similar or dissimilar, right?
Okay, thank you. That is very helpful.
Yeah, and this is, let me see.
It's like when I talk with Cam about like his smoker and the algorithms used to figure out stuff. I'm just like, I know what you mean.
Let me see if I can find a really good one here. Yeah, this doesn't help.
These diagrams are very helpful. This is just like asserting the fact that I don't know. I'm totally lost here. No.
So for example, one of the things that you might be like looking at here, these are all different themes, right? So you might, you see students and teachers are kind of related in this like space, right? And in this case, it's, I don't know, I guess it's like three dimensions. if you were to try to conceptualize like 1,000 dimensions, it gets really hard. But like if you were to look at it across these different sort of, in this space, right, you can see that things that are related are sort of close to each other, and things that are not related are sort of far from each other. And so, again, students and teachers, teaching and taught, these are things that are related. So that's why you see these data points or these words or even sentences, you see them really close to each other, right? And so that you can think of it in a similar way. So now if you sort of were looking for like hiking boots and you wanted to perform a search using these sort of embeddings, right, these numbers, you would just do a comparison of, are these things close to each other? Or are they not? Anyway, there's a reason why I didn't get into embeddings this chat. You could really you could have a whole show on embeddings. Yeah, so I tried to get away from the only thing that the takeaway here is just the text turns into numbers in order to make it easy to perform comparisons of what's like similar and what's not similar. Right.
I love that. That's awesome.
And so this is kind of what it would look like. Again, to you and I, this means nothing, but when you're doing comparisons of relevant documents, it kind of somehow it works out.
I'm going to interject real quick. We got one question here from a first-time chat from Twitch. They're asking, can you send files through the API as we can with like the code interpreter from websites like Excel documents or PDFs, things like that?
Yeah, so I know that there was a recent release of the SDK, like the ones that I'm using here, I think in general are beta 5 and beta 6 just launched like a few days ago. I don't know what the changes are with that. In general, I'm going to say no. Right, or at least with the Azure SDK, as far as I know, but
not yet,
happy to be corrected. Yeah.
And we're still in beta with that, right? Still, they're still working on, the API surface area. So that's actually a really good point. We should probably drop a link in here. And if you are consuming the .NET SDK for Azure, specifically the Azure AI, OpenAI, we encourage you to, put proposals out there. If there's an API that exists in OpenAI that we don't have yet, that's codified, and you want to see it, let us know about it. And our team of engineers will be happy to have those discussions.
Yeah, I don't know why this is not running. For some reason, it's not finding the notebooks. Let me just try to close it and open it back up. Kernel. No, that's not it. Yeah, sorry. So I'm not going to be able to run this one, but effectively, you're just using the data to try to find relevant samples and inject those. As you can see in this prompt, it's a little bit. Let me try to go up to the prompt here. As you can see in the prompt here, I have the sources space here where I'm able to inject. Once I perform a search against relevant documents, I inject those into my prompt, and now that's what I'm going to be using to help me answer my questions. I know we're out of time, so any last minute questions, happy to answer them. And
oh my God, that hour went by so fast.
I know. I was like, I don't think I have enough content. And then,
oh my gosh.
Yeah, you guys have been awesome with the questions.
Awesome. Yeah, this has been great. Cam, I'll let you take it away.
Yeah, sure. We'll wind it down. Thank you, Luis, for coming on as our guest today. Again, Luis, you can catch Luis not every Monday, but many Mondays on this stream, as he is also a co-host of on .NET Live. Thank you, everybody else, for watching on .NET Live. I'd like to do a special shout out to our viewers on Facebook. I don't think we've been streaming on Facebook very long. This is the first time I've done a stream on Facebook anyway. Check out our other great .NET Live TV streams and videos at .net/live. Tune in next week when our guest Bertrand Leroy will be talking about Lunar Core. With that, play me out, David.
Sounds good. Thank you. Bye, friends.